Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Maartje, for the kind invitation to speak here today. Um, Dear friends of Dutch and Flemish art from the Middle Ages until the present time, I was asked to say something about the history of installations, and I'm very happy to do so. Um, Wim Vroom, one of the former directors of the historical department of the Amsterdam Museum, once told me, and Chris said something of the kind, that the design of a permanent collection would typically stand for a generation. So more or less for 20 to 30 years. And I guess this point was widely shared at the time. In Vroom's particular case, it must also have been defined by the fact that he, as the newly appointed director of the historical department of the Rijksmuseum in 1972, inherited a installation of this part of the collection from his predecessor, Dick Couvé, that had been realized only just before Vroom took over. And like so many directors who leave after a major building campaign, Couvé must have thought that his job at the Rijksmuseum was more or less done after rearranging the objects in his department and left to become the director of the Frans Museum in Haarlem. And in fact, it took Vroom until the early 1990s, so almost 20 years, before he got the opportunity to rethink and reinstall his department. Reflecting on Vroom's remark, I tried to remember what the Rijksmuseum looked like when I visited as a child and a youngster in the 1960s. Not that I was a very eager or frequent visitor of the museum at that age, but my loving parents recognized early that I had become interested in the world of culture, particularly classical music and the visual arts. And every now and then they took me to a museum in Amsterdam, for instance, the National Maritime Museum in its former location, later on Christie's venue. And I remember visiting the Rembrandt exhibition in the Rijksmuseum together with my mum in 1969. My brothers and sisters and I were also lucky to have an aunt and an uncle who, that's not me, by the way, who cared much about us and did everything they could to stimulate our capacities and interest. And I remember visiting the museum with my uncle one afternoon, probably in the mid-60s, with a guard guiding us to the elaborately worked silver plate by Paulus van Vianen. And although I must confess that I do not distinctly remember, this is what the Gallery of Honor looked like at the time. As you can see, it felt rather homely, with the parquet floor, the heavy curtains between the gallery and the cabinets, many benches to sit on, tables with some sculptures, chandeliers hanging from the vault. And at the same time, it was very spacious with the whitewashed walls, mainly large paintings by international artists and very few visitors. This was also the museum of my years as a student in art history. Every week at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, we were taught in the museum, close to the general public at that early hour, standing for 1 or 2 hours in front of one individual painting, discussing its features and qualities. And sometimes we went to visit the so-called study collection in the basement. It was only later that I realized that museums have their own histories and that every generation, every director, every single curator makes his or her personal choices in collecting and exhibiting works of art on the one hand, and on the other hand, that many of these choices are defined by broader culture perspectives and fashions that are dominant at the time. So let me take you back a little bit further in time, because already at the beginning of the age of the public museum, French revolutionaries discussed the best way to show the hundreds of paintings that they had brought together, or rather taken, not only from convents and aristocrats in Paris and the rest of France, but also from Italy, the southern and northern Netherlands, and other allied or conquered states in Europe. After long deliberation, the paintings were classified along the lines of les trois écoles, that is, Italian, French, and Netherlandish, or rather, Northern painting. This was essentially a scheme developed by the European community of 18th century art historians, art dealers, auctioneers, and art lovers. The French were adamant that they wanted to liberate the arts from the chains of church and aristocracy in order to present all objects of beauty to the Republic. But in a way, they educated the people in the same aesthetics as the privileged previous private owners of these works had favored. Seen from a revolutionary perspective, Dutch art had one major advantage over Italian, French, and in some ways also Flemish painting. Its presumed bourgeois and realistic qualities seemed to fit miraculously well with the ideals of the French Revolution. So it is that we find many positive valuations of works by Douw, Van Ostade and other Dutch and a few Flemish painters in French art historical literature and the public press at the time. And I cannot resist the temptation to quote the famous anecdote as told by a Dutch art historian at the time, who overheard a conversation between two farmers who admired Potter's bull for its veracity, and they thought that this was the most beautiful painting in the Louvre at the time. But we got it back in 1815. The Rijksmuseum opened its doors in the wake of the foundations of the Louvre in May 1800, after the so-called Batavian Revolution, as the National Art Gallery in Huis ten Bosch in The Hague, not in Amsterdam, with a distinct mission. First, to educate people in the aesthetic qualities of Italian and Netherlands art, Netherlandish painting, both north and southern, and to teach them the patriotic Dutch Batavian values for the presentation of national heroes and important scenes from Dutch history. There were rooms devoted to French, Italian and Dutch classicist painting, Dutch genre painting, and to historical figures and events that celebrated without reserve the political independence and the economic dominance of the Dutch, also in their colonial empire. This dual mission, in which the myth of the Dutch Golden Age, both in its political, social, economic and aesthetic sense, was presented as one unbreakable union, held on in many ways during the entire 19th century, also after the transferal of the national collections to the Royal Palace in Amsterdam in 1808, subsequently to the Trippenhuis, like you see here, in 1817. And here's a photo of that situation at the end of the 19th century. And after the opening of the present Rijksmuseum building in Amsterdam in 1885, in a wonderful mix of 19th century sculpture and pictures from all periods and styles. And by the end of the 19th century, when most European nation states had built and opened their own national art museum, and many regions and cities their own local museums, often in a mix of art and history, the main functions of the museum seems to have been that of an open repository, a warehouse in which hundreds of thousands of objects were kept and shown in a kind of shock and awe way. The sheer sight of these thousands of objects must have been bewildering and at best awe-inspiring for the visitors in those days. All for the great accomplishments of artists through the ages maybe, but probably mainly patriotic pride in the glorious past of one's own city, region or nation. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the tide began to turn. Museums were overloaded and usually underfunded, and the visitors perhaps overwhelmed by the numbers, but underwhelmed by the quality and the material state of many individual artworks. Cornelis Hofstede de Groot, one of the great historians of Dutch art, complained in 1905 that the Rijksmuseum had become a refuge for too many homeless works of art of poor quality. A more selective, educational and aesthetically satisfying presentation was now thought to be the right way to move forward. In Holland, this was brought about partly by one man, Frederik Schmid-Degener, the first director of Museum Boijmans in Rotterdam, and from 1920-21 of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And I must pay tribute to our mourned friend and colleague Ger Luiten for his still excellent article from 1984 on the accomplishments of Schmid-Degener for Dutch museums. And this is what Schmid-Degener did in Boijmans, housed in the so-called Schielandhuis at the time. He made a deliberate selection of the best works in the collection, organized limited numbers of painting, usually in 1 or 2 rows, in a strictly symmetrical way along the walls, and made combinations with a limited number of objects of applied art, usually placed on and around 1 or more tables and cupboards. And when Schmid-Degener became the director of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam in 1921, he embarked upon the same mission, again with very well balanced results. In Schmid-Degener museums there was also ample opportunity for sitting and resting, and at times there were interesting interactions between all categories of art. We do not exactly know what other museums and collections inspired him. I guess primarily the stately homes of the English and French aristocracy, and maybe the large mansions of wealthy American collectors. And he certainly was not alone in his aesthetic preferences. Other museums in the Netherlands and elsewhere followed his example, like here the Frans Museum in the 1930s, and here a few pictures from Antwerp. And in many ways, the Rijksmuseum, as I came to know it in my youth, although redesigned after the Second World War, kept many of the characteristics of Schmid-Degener's opinions and preferences. The museum was meant to sustain the notion of quiet, unhampered, and undistracted observation and reflection of the object. No intrusive sounds, restrained decoration, enough places to rest, and that is also the museum as I remember it. When my mother took me to the Frans Museum in the late 1960s, you could still see the period rooms. And in summer, there were evenings at which the museum was only lit by candlelight. Those were the days. But when Dick Couvé moved from the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum to Haarlem in 1972, things started to change. Couvé killed the candlelight visits as being too romantic. Period rooms in Haarlem and elsewhere were heavily discussed as being 20th century constructions rather than honest representations of the historical past. And in hindsight, it feels a bit like the movement towards the historically informed performance of music from 1600 to, say, 1900, and period instruments or the reconstructions, best expressed in 1970, around the same time, by mouth of the famous recorder player and later conductor Frans, who bluntly stated that every note of Mozart and Beethoven, as played by the world-famous Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, was a lie. It was now time for a fundamental reflection on the role and function of the museum in society, and thus on the way works of art were presented and commented upon. I think there are 2 main currents that originate from this discussion. First, the acceptance of the importance of education in the museum, as exemplified in the reinstalled Amsterdam Historical Museum in the 1970s, 1975, with highly informative arrangements and texts, and the experimental, thematic, if you want, transhistorical installation of the paintings in the Centraal Museum in Utrecht of 1978 is another case in point. The other movement is one towards the museum as a white cube, with Wim Quist's design of the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum as the most telling example. Some people have observed that this whitewashing was the triumph of the modern art museum over the traditional Museum of Fine Arts, but I think there was a more general tendency towards bright, light, empty and spacious rooms in many buildings at the time, also in the museum. Most of you have lived long enough to have witnessed more recent developments, and others will look back on the past 10 years during this conference. As I see it now, there are a few major challenges and opportunities for the museum, also for collections of Dutch and Flemish art worldwide. First of all, visitors numbers have gone up enormously. partly as a result of the impulse given by education, partly, especially in bigger museums, in tourist centers, as a result of mass tourism. Despite the climate crisis we're in, I don't think this is going to change anytime soon. High numbers of visitors of the museum are here to stay, and they demand enough room to take a proper look at the museum objects and a certain predictability also in the museum supply. Some favorites, like Vermeer's girl with the pearl earring, must be on view at all times. Second, the internet has done a lot to the museum. No study collections anymore, but full electronic access to the complete collection 24/7. The 19th century museum as a depository may have been fun to some, or a disaster to many. The classic reproach to the museum that only a fraction of its possessions are on show is now effectively countered by many new technical possibilities, not just the electronic depot, but also all kinds of interactive tools that give endless possibilities to visitors in the flash and online to explore the collection. Obviously, this affects hugely the installation of permanent collections. The white cube is dead. Long live the colored cubes. Personally, I'm completely fine with all kinds of design. They will keep changing, and more broadly speaking, and we will hear of this, I think, hereafter. And whether you like it or not, architects and designers now have a big say in the installation of permanent collections, more than 30 or 20 years ago. And if treated wisely, this also says something about the hugely increased professionalism of the art museum in our age, I think. Fourth, in my observation, the transhistorical experiment has not resulted in a convincing new strategy for the reinstallation of permanent collections. And why not? I guess mainly because in many instances it's not much more than some kind of inter-artistic play between living and dead artists, which is fine. But it does usually not really help, in my opinion, visitors to relate in a meaningful way to the past, both in its historical and artistic or cultural dimensions. The importance of the museum as a room for education and discussion is now bigger than ever. Museums own objects of high artistic value that can move people from diverse backgrounds, comfort them, give solace even, and especially for its enormous variety of subjects, art from the southern and northern Netherlands can help people to reflect on all kinds of aspects of nature, human life, culture, not in a transhistorical way per se, but as an inspirational force and a starting point for discussion or disruption. Which brings me to my final point. I know that some curators fear that the historical debate will thwart every aesthetic pleasure. The room for quiet, unhampered and undistracted observation and reflection, like I have known it in my youth, now seems to be taken either by millions of tourists or loud discussions about issues of inclusion and exclusion, the distribution of wealth in medieval, early modern and modern society, the acquisition of objects from nearby and afar, colonial, post-colonial relationships, and the representation of all these and other aspects in the domain of the arts in the Netherlands. I think this is inevitable and in many ways also a necessary and healthy development, and I trust that the amazing quality and diversity of the art of the Netherlands are strong enough to keep inspiring people all over the world in many, many wondrous ways. In 2013, after a period of more than 10 years of restoration, renovation, rebuilding, reflection, rethinking, and complete reinstallation, the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum reopened its doors. Other museums, and some have already been mentioned, but Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum, Braunschweig, Antwerp, of course, Boston, Stockholm, where we are here now today, Lakenhal in Leiden, Centraal Museum Utrecht, and recently highlighted on the CODART website, the Museum Hof van Busleiden in Mechelen, I look forward to visiting that, have also gone through a similar process of reflection and reinstallation, and others will definitely follow. And will all these reinstallations of the permanent collection stand for a generation, like Wim Vroom presumed in the 1990s? Chris said already something of the kind. You and I know they won't. Believe it or not, the museum, the art museum, has become quite a dynamic organization in a world of ever-speeding energy. And almost every evening after closing time, I'm being told, there are alterations in the permanent installation of the Rijksmuseum. And now, Chris already said that too, like here in Stockholm, 11 years after reopening, the staff of the Rijksmuseum has embarked upon a fundamental herijking, recalibration of the museum. So maybe the time of permanent collections, if there ever really was one, has gone for good. Thank you.